The letter was already damp. A single cold drop of November rain had landed right on the dollar amount, making the ink bleed like a fresh wound. $4,000. My hand tightened around the worn wooden handle of the geological hammer I'd been meaning to put away for a week. Funny how you hold on to old tools. They become a part of you. This one had been in my hand through deserts and mountains, but tonight it felt heavier. It was just past 5 p.m., and darkness had already swallowed my backyard. The only light came from the kitchen window behind me, casting a weak yellow rectangle on the glistening, rain-slicked patio. The air smelled of wet asphalt and that clean, sharp scent of ozone that comes with a dying storm. It was the kind of chill that gets into your bones. $4,000 for non-compliant aesthetic coloring. That's what the letter from the Homeowners Association said. You know, sometimes you read a sentence so divorced from reality, you have to read it again just to make sure you haven't had a stroke. Aesthetic coloring. They were talking about the single line of blue tiles running through the mosaic at the bottom of my pool. That wasn't just a design choice, that was a memorial. My son Daniel had been a police officer. That thin blue line under the water was for him. It was all I had left of him here. I built it myself 2 summers ago, laying each tile with my own hands. The neighbors knew. The old board president had even shaken my hand and told me it was a beautiful tribute. But things change. New people take over. This happened to me, and if you've been watching Karenology for a while, you know it's never just about the color of your pool tiles. It's always about something else. I looked up from the letter, my eyes scanning the quiet tree-lined street. Most people were inside, escaping the miserable weather. Have you ever been hit with a rule so absurd, so heartless, it feels like it's from another planet? You feel this hot surge of anger, but underneath it, there's a cold knot of dread. Because you know the person who wrote it doesn't care about your reasons. They only care about the rule. If that feeling hits a little too close to home, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps to know you're not alone in this crazy world. That's when I saw it, a vehicle crawling down the street so slowly it barely seemed to be moving. It was a black SUV, one of those big expensive ones with tinted windows that drink up the light. It didn't belong here. Our neighborhood was mostly sensible sedans and minivans. It slid to a stop directly across from my house, its engine a low, barely audible hum beneath the drumming of the rain. I stood perfectly still, half hidden in the shadows of my porch. The letter felt like a block of ice in my hand. My heart, which had been pounding with anger, slowed to a heavy, deliberate thump. This wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't a delivery. This was something else. The passenger door opened. A man in a tailored dark suit stepped out, holding a small, open umbrella. He wasn't big, but he moved with a kind of compact efficiency that told you he was used to being in charge. He didn't look at me. He didn't even glance toward the house. He just stood there on the curb, his polished shoes inches from a growing puddle. Then he lifted his phone. He started taking pictures, not of the whole house, not in a way a real estate agent would. He was methodical. He took a picture of the front gate. Then he walked a few paces and framed a shot of the side yard. And then he paused, his phone aimed for a long time at the corner of my property. The part with the pool, the part with the low stone retaining wall that separated my patio from the sloping yard. My blood went cold. I'm a high school science teacher now, but for 20 years, I was a field geologist. I've spent more time looking at rock formations and soil strata than most people spend looking at TV. I know what's important and what's not. And the way he was focusing on that wall, it wasn't about aesthetics. He took another picture, then another. He lowered the phone, slid it into his pocket, and got back into the SUV without a single backward glance. The vehicle pulled away as silently as it had arrived, its red taillights disappearing into the gloom. I was left alone in the rain with a $4,000 fine for blue tiles and the chilling image of a stranger photographing my retaining wall. The two things felt completely disconnected, yet my gut screamed they were part of the same ugly puzzle. The letter wasn't the attack. The letter was the distraction. I looked down at the geological hammer in my hand, its steel head pitted and scarred, its handle smooth from years of use. I'd used it to break rocks, to find what was hidden beneath the surface. I walked off the porch, the cold rain soaking my shirt in seconds, and crossed the patio to the retaining wall. I ran my hand over the damp, rough-hewn stone. It felt solid, stable. But what that man was looking for wasn't on the surface. I lifted the hammer. The sound it made when it struck the stone echoed in the quiet night. It wasn't a clean, sharp crack. It was a dull, strangely muted thud. The sound of something that wasn't quite right. That dull thud hung in the air long after the rain had swallowed it. It was a dead sound, a sound of earth that had lost its integrity. I struck the wall again, harder this time. Same thing. It was like hitting a punching bag filled with wet sand instead of solid rock. Something was wrong under my feet, and it had nothing to do with pool tiles. For 2 days, an uneasy quiet settled over the neighborhood. The rain stopped, leaving behind a sky the color of a dull nickel, and a world that dripped and sighed. Then, on the third morning, it happened. I was letting the dog out when I saw it. A crater, about 5 feet across, had opened up right next to my fence line. The grass was just gone, swallowed by a pit of muddy, dark soil. The smell of damp, disturbed earth was thick in the air, a raw, primal scent. My fence post, once vertical, now leaned into the void at a drunken angle. My stomach clenched. It wasn't a huge sinkhole, not the kind that swallows cars, but it was a wound in the earth exactly where that man in the suit had been pointing his phone. I did what you're supposed to do. I called the homeowners association. I expected a callback, maybe a visit from the grounds committee in a day or two. What I got was an email an hour later. It wasn't from the usual HOA address. It came from a law firm, Vale & Associates, with a PDF attachment. The language in that document was cold, sharp, and designed to terrify. It talked about gross negligence, unstable subsoil conditions, and unmitigated hydrostatic pressure from my pool. It connected the sinkhole directly to my unauthorized pool modifications, the blue tiles. The logic was insane, but it was written on official letterhead. And then came the hammer blow. I was required to immediately fund an emergency geotechnical survey to assess the risk to the community. The firm designated for this mandatory survey? Vale Geotechnical Solutions. The cost, due within 10 days, was $15,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. $15,000. I'm a teacher. I don't have that kind of money just lying around. But it wasn't just the money. It was the accusation. It was that word, negligence. You know, everyone has a ghost, a moment in their past that haunts them. Mine has a name, Kevin. He was a student in my advanced chemistry class a few years back. Bright kid, eager, maybe a little too confident. We were doing a thermal decomposition experiment. I turned away for a second, just a second, to answer another student's question. In that moment, Kevin, impatient, must have cranked the heat too high. The flask cracked, a spray of hot liquid, a scream. He wasn't badly hurt, just some second-degree burns on his arm, but the investigation, the school board, the whispers from other parents, they broke something in me. The official report cleared me, but I never cleared myself. I missed a safety check. I was responsible. Have you ever had a mistake follow you like a shadow, a failure that you can't outrun, no matter how hard you try? This letter from Vale's lawyers felt like that shadow falling over me again. It was the same script. I had been careless. I had put people in danger. The panic was a cold flood rising in my chest, a physical thing that made it hard to breathe. The urge to just write the check, to borrow the money, to make it all go away, was overwhelming. My hands were shaking. I actually reached for my laptop to check my bank balance to see if there was any way. But then I stopped. I looked out the window at the hole in my yard. I remembered the dull thud of my hammer against the wall. I remembered the cold, methodical way that man took his pictures. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was a plan. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Vale's law firm. A crisp, detached voice answered. Mr. Vale's office. I explained who I was, my voice steadier than I felt. I told the assistant I was a geologist, that I could assess the situation myself. Her reply was a masterpiece of polite condescension. Ms. Sharma, your personal credentials are not at issue, she said, her tone as sterile as a hospital room. The community bylaws require an independent certified assessment. Vale Geotechnical is the association's designated partner for such matters. Designated partner? I shot back. It sounds more like a designated shakedown. There was a pause. For a second, I thought I heard the faint, rhythmic click-clack of something in the background, like a toy. Then the assistant's voice returned, even colder this time. The letter specifies your obligations. If the payment is not received, the association will be forced to take further legal action to protect the community's assets. Have a good day." The line went dead. I stood there, the phone humming in my ear, the silence in my house roaring. Protect the community's assets by forcing me to pay the man who was threatening me. The trap was perfect. It was elegant, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The rain started again, a soft tapping on the window pane, like fingers drumming impatiently. The drumming of the rain on the glass was a countdown. Each tap was a second I didn't have, a dollar I couldn't spend. The silence after the phone call was worse than the threats. It was the sound of a well-laid trap, and I was the animal caught in it, waiting for the hunter to return. My first instinct was to fight back the way I knew how, with data and logic, but Mr. Vale wasn't playing that game. The very next day, the battlefield shifted online. Our neighborhood has one of those private community forums. It's usually filled with posts about lost cats and garage sales. But overnight, it had turned toxic. A new thread appeared, titled "Safety Concerns on Elm Street." There was no mention of my name, not at first. Just anonymous posts from concerned neighbor and local parent. They posted grainy pictures of the sinkhole. They talked about property values. They speculated wildly about unstable ground. The air was thick with manufactured panic. "I heard the whole hillside could be at risk," one wrote. Another added, "My kids play on that street. Is it even safe?" Then came the second wave. It was more personal. A new account posted a link to an audio file. "Heard this from a friend who knows the teacher on Elm Street," the post read. I clicked it. My stomach dropped. It was a voice. My voice. But it wasn't. It was a digital ghost, a twisted echo of me. "I always cut a few corners," the voice said, sounding casual, almost bragging. "Safety regulations are just suggestions, right?" It was a dip fake, a cheap, nasty one, but convincing enough for people who wanted to believe it. The sound was tinny, artificial, like a voice coming from a cheap plastic toy. But it was my face they pictured saying those words. The whispers at the grocery store started that afternoon. The averted eyes, the sudden silence when I walked down an aisle. I was no longer Sarah Sharma, the chemistry teacher. I was a menace, a liability, the woman who was going to bring the whole neighborhood down with her. The isolation was a physical weight pressing in on me. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I thought of my father. He was a practical man, a builder. He always said, "The answer's in the paperwork, Sarah, always." He'd had a friend, Arthur Vance, a retired insurance agent who knew every permit, every zoning variance in this county going back 50 years. I found his number in my dad's old address book. Arthur, a man with a kind, wrinkled face and a handshake like warm leather, came over the next day. He smelled faintly of old paper and peppermint. He listened to my story, his brow furrowed with concern. "Vale," he said, tasting the name. "He's a shark in a tailored suit, but even sharks have to follow the rules." He promised to help. For 2 days, he disappeared into the dusty county archives. He returned on a Friday evening, carrying a heavy buckled briefcase. He spread a set of large, rolled-up blueprints across my dining room table. They were the original construction plans for my house and the lot, dated 1988. "Here we are," he said, his finger tracing a line. "Pool installation, retaining wall, soil compaction tests. It's all here, signed and sealed. Your construction was by the book. This is your silver bullet." A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost made my knees buckle. It was proof, tangible, official proof. But as I leaned in closer, my eyes caught something. A detail. The signature of the county engineer, a man named Henderson, looked off. The loop of the H was too perfect, the pressure of the pen too uniform. It was a small thing, something you'd only notice if you'd spent years analyzing subtle variations in data. "Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "look at the signature." He squinted, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his pocket. He stared at it for a long moment. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "It looks stamped, almost printed." Henderson's signature was always a mess. We were looking at a forgery. This wasn't a silver bullet. This was a poisoned arrow. My heart sank. But what could I do? It was the only official document we had. Ignoring our misgivings, we made a high-quality copy, and I sent it via certified mail to the Homeowners Association, along with a letter demanding they retract the fine and the order for the survey. It felt like walking into a trap, but it was the only path I could see. The response was faster than I ever could have imagined. It came 3 days later. Not an email, not a phone call. It was a knock on the door. A courier stood on my porch, holding out a stiff formal envelope. Inside was not a letter from the HOA. It was a legal summons. They weren't just rejecting my proof. They were accusing me of submitting a fraudulent document to the county. The summons wasn't for a fine. It was for a formal hearing. The charge was no longer negligence. It was fraud. The document that was supposed to save me had just been used to put a noose around my neck. The summons felt heavier than a tombstone. It was a formal declaration of war, and I was losing badly. The charge of fraud was a masterstroke. It didn't matter if I could prove the original document was a fake. I was the one who submitted it. In the eyes of the law, I was the one who had lied. The hearing was set for 2 weeks. The walls were closing in, fast. That night, sleep was a stranger. I kept seeing the smug, placid face of Mr. Vale, a man I'd only met once, at a community picnic years ago. I remembered him checking his old-fashioned pocket watch, a gold-plated heirloom that seemed out of place with his modern, expensive suit. The memory was a splinter in my mind, irrelevant but irritating. I paced my small house, the floorboards groaning under my feet, the smell of dust and old books doing nothing to soothe me. Have you ever felt so cornered that your own home starts to feel like a cage? The very air seems to get thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. My savings were draining away on legal consultations. The first lawyer I spoke to was blunt. "They have you on a technicality," he said, peering at me over his glasses. "The best you can hope for is to plead ignorance and settle. It'll cost you, but it's better than a fraud charge on your record." It felt like being told to apologize to a mugger. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The HOA board, led by Vale's invisible hand, passed an emergency bylaw. Citing the ongoing legal dispute and potential safety liabilities, they suspended my voting rights within the community. My voice was officially silenced. The $15,000 survey fee was now listed as a lien against my property. A lien. That's a legal claim, a financial chain they could use to choke me. The total on their invoices was now just shy of $20,000. I was an outcast, a pariah with a shrinking bank account and a looming court date. My one piece of evidence had backfired spectacularly. Arthur was devastated, apologizing over and over. But it wasn't his fault. We had played their game, and they had rigged the board. I was sitting in my classroom late one afternoon, long after the students had gone home. The room smelled of chalk dust and burnt sugar from a botched experiment. I was staring at a diagram of molecular bonds, but all I could see was the web they were weaving around me. I felt a familiar despair creeping in. The same cold resignation I'd felt after Kevin's accident. Maybe the lawyer was right. Maybe I should just give up, pay them, sell the house, run. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Mr. Vale's former groundskeeper. He fired me last week. Meet me at the diner on Route 7 in 1 hour. Come alone. You need to know what he's really doing." The message was a jolt of electricity. It could be a trick, another trap. But what choice did I have? I was already caught. I grabbed my coat. The diner was one of those old classic places with cracked red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked since the 90s. The air hummed with the quiet clatter of cutlery and smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease. A man sat in the last booth, hunched over a cup of coffee. He was wiry, with tired eyes and hands stained with dirt and oil. He introduced himself as Mike. He didn't waste time. "Vale doesn't care about your pool, lady," he said, his voice low and raspy. "He's not after your money. He's after your land, all of it." Mike explained that for months he'd been ordered to do strange jobs at night, not planting flowers or mowing lawns. He was running small, flexible drill lines under several properties on the edge of the neighborhood, mine included. "He called it soil testing," Mike scoffed. "We were drilling core samples, deep ones, 10, sometimes 20 feet down." My geologist brain, dormant for so long, snapped to attention. Core samples. That wasn't for building foundations. That was for mineral exploration. "The sinkholes?" I asked, my heart pounding. "He made them," Mike said simply. We used a high-pressure water jet. He called it accelerated erosion. He needed an excuse, a reason to declare the area unstable so he could get the county to rezone it. He wants to buy everyone out for pennies on the dollar before anyone knows what's really under there. It was all starting to make sense. The man with the phone, the focus on the retaining wall, the fake safety concerns. The fraud charge was designed to discredit me, to make sure no one would listen if I started asking the right questions. "What's under there, Mike?" I asked. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim diner light. "I'm no geologist," he said, "but the last core samples we pulled from right under your property, they had these little gray veins running through them. When the light hit them just right, they shined, almost like silver." I left the diner with my mind racing. Silver was unlikely, but lithium, rare earth minerals, the possibilities were dizzying. I had no proof, just the word of a disgruntled ex-employee. It wasn't enough for a court, but it was enough for me. It was a thread. I got home and went straight to my garage. In a dusty footlocker under a pile of old camping gear was my old field kit. I pulled out my geological hammer, my sample bags, and a set of soil testing vials. My hands didn't shake anymore. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. They had picked the wrong person to bully. They thought I was just a teacher. They forgot what I used to be. That night, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a geologist. And I was going to dig up the truth, one sample at a time. The battle wasn't going to be fought in a courtroom. It was going to be fought in the dirt. The night was my new laboratory. For a week, I lived a double life. By day, I was Mrs. Sharma, teaching teenagers about covalent bonds and stoichiometry, smiling politely at the neighbors who now avoided my gaze. But after midnight, I was a ghost in my own backyard, armed with a hammer and a trowel. The moon, a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, was my only witness. I started at the sinkhole, working my way out in a careful grid. The ground was soft, yielding. I took samples every 5 feet, bagging and labeling them with a precision that felt like a homecoming. The air was cold and smelled of damp leaves and rich, dark soil. It felt clean. It felt honest. It was a world away from the lies and legal threats. But Vale was smart. He wasn't just attacking me, he was isolating me. The Concerned Neighbors online forum had become a public pillory. My name was now being used openly. Sarah Sharma's negligence is going to cost us all. Has anyone seen the legal notice? She committed fraud. They even posted my school's phone number, encouraging people to call the principal and demand my suspension. The pressure worked. One afternoon, my principal, a decent man trapped in an impossible position, called me into his office. He looked tired. He couldn't fire me, not yet, but he had to place me on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the hearing. I was being sent home. I walked out of the school that day feeling a profound sense of humiliation. I had lost my job. Even if it was temporary, I had lost my standing in the community. The economic toll was brutal. No paycheck, mounting legal fees, and that $20,000 lien hanging over my head like a guillotine. That same evening, Arthur called. His voice was heavy with defeat. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I talked to a friend at the county clerk's office. The original blueprint, the one from 1988, it's gone, vanished from the archives. The only version on record now is the copy you submitted, the one with the forged signature." It was a checkmate, a perfect crushing move. My one piece of flawed evidence was now the only evidence. There was no way to prove I hadn't created it. This was Vale's world. He didn't just bend the rules, he erased them and wrote his own. That was the moment I almost broke. I sat at my kitchen table, the sample bags laid out before me, and just stared into space. What was I even doing? Playing in the dirt while a master manipulator dismantled my life, piece by piece. The fight felt hopeless. I was alone, jobless, and on the verge of being branded a criminal. The silence in the house was deafening. Is this what it feels like to be completely and utterly beaten? To have no moves left on the board? I picked up my old geological hammer, its weight familiar in my palm. I thought about giving up. I could sell, I could run, I could disappear. And then I looked at the handle. It was wrapped in old, worn electrical tape, covering a crack I'd put in it years ago on a dig in the Sierras. My father had fixed it for me. He hadn't bought a new handle. He had painstakingly glued the pieces, clamped them, and then wrapped it for strength. You don't throw away a good tool just because it's broken, he'd said. You find a way to make it strong again. His voice, so clear in my memory, was like a splash of cold water. I wasn't broken, I was being tested. And I wasn't going to fight this battle on Vale's terms anymore. I wasn't going to play defense in a courtroom. I was going to change the game entirely. I spent the next 2 days in the school's chemistry lab, which my principal had quietly agreed I could still use for curriculum development. I wasn't developing curriculum. I was running tests. I pulverized the soil samples, dissolved them in acids, ran them through a spectrometer. Most of the samples were normal: clay, sand, loam, nothing special. But the samples from the deepest part of the sinkhole and the ones from a new, almost invisible hole I found hidden behind a thicket of bushes near the back of my property, they were different. After the acid bath, tiny metallic flecks remained. They weren't silver. Under the microscope, they had a specific crystalline structure. I cross-referenced the spectrographic data with a geological database. It wasn't a precious metal. It was something far more valuable in today's market. The soil under my house, under the whole neighborhood, was rich with lithium. Not just trace amounts, commercially viable deposits. This wasn't about a few houses. This was a multi-million-dollar treasure hunt, and Vale was about to win the prize. The knowledge was a weapon, but it was a strange one. How do you prove the existence of a hidden resource that no one is looking for? How do you use that to fight a fraud charge? Telling people there was lithium under their homes would sound crazy, like a conspiracy theory. Vale would just paint me as an unstable crackpot. I needed more than data. I needed a demonstration. I needed to show, not tell. A new plan began to form in my mind, a wild, desperate gamble. It was a plan that would require perfect timing, a bit of showmanship, and a complete disregard for the rules of conventional warfare. Vale thought he was playing chess. I was about to flip the whole board over. The first step was to find the right stage, and I knew exactly where it would be. The county was holding a public auction for a parcel of undeveloped land that bordered our neighborhood. It was a sleepy, bureaucratic affair, usually attended by a handful of developers. But I knew one person who would be there for sure, Mr. Vale, and I was going to make sure everyone was watching when he placed his bid. The auction was my stage, but I knew I couldn't just walk in and start shouting about lithium. I needed to build a narrative. I needed to turn Vale's own strategy of public opinion against him. I started with the one resource I had left, my reputation as a teacher. Not the one Vale was trying to build, but the real one. For 20 years, I had taught hundreds of kids in this town. Their parents knew me. They trusted me. I spent the next 3 days on the phone. I didn't talk about fraud or sinkholes. I talked about science. I called the parents of my former students, especially those in the neighborhood. I'm working on a community science project, I'd say, my voice calm and academic. We're doing a live demonstration on soil composition and resource mapping. It's a great educational opportunity. It's at the county auction on Tuesday. Can you and your kids make it? I framed it as a learning experience. I posted an event on the local parents' Facebook group, Explore the Hidden Science Under Your Feet. It was vague, but intriguing. Slowly, a small current of interest began to build. It wasn't a viral campaign. It was quiet, grassroots, and built on 2 decades of trust. Meanwhile, I prepared my demonstration. I filled a dozen large glass cylinders with the soil samples I had collected. Most were just plain dark earth, but 3 of them, the ones from the deepest parts of the drill sites, were different. I didn't mark them. To the casual eye, they all looked the same. I also packed a kit from the school lab: beakers, reagents, a portable hot plate, and a digital pH meter. It looked every bit like a high school science fair project. The night before the auction, I made one more trip. I went to the undeveloped lot that was being auctioned off. It was a scrubby piece of land, covered in weeds and old tires. I spent an hour there, taking soil samples from the surface. Just as I suspected, they were clean. No lithium, no traces of anything valuable. I bagged them separately. This was the final piece of my trap. The auction was held in a stuffy wood-paneled room at the county courthouse. The air smelled of old paper and floor polish. About 30 people were there, mostly developers in suits and a few bored-looking county officials. But in the back, clustered near the doors, were about 15 parents and a dozen kids I had personally invited. They looked a little confused, clutching the event flyer I had made, my small army of the curious. Then Mr. Vale walked in. He was exactly as I remembered. Immaculate suit, polished shoes, an air of untouchable confidence. He took a seat in the front row, not even glancing at the rest of us. He was here to conduct a business transaction, a final, quiet victory. He didn't see me standing in the back, next to a folding table laden with my glass cylinders and chemistry equipment. To him, I was just part of the scenery. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a rapid-fire delivery, started the proceedings. He droned on about zoning and lot dimensions. Vale sat patiently, occasionally glancing at his gold pocket watch, the one he'd been fiddling with at the picnic. Suddenly, that splinter in my mind sharpened into a point. The watch. The rhythmic clicking I'd heard on the phone with his assistant. It wasn't a toy. It was the sound of him tapping his watch. It was a nervous habit. The untouchable Mr. Vale had a tell. The bidding started on the parcel of land. 2 developers made initial bids. Vale let them go back and forth, driving the price up slightly. Then, just as the auctioneer was about to close, Vale raised his hand. He didn't speak. He just made a calm, decisive gesture. His bid was $100,000 over the last one. A hush fell over the room. The other developers shook their heads and lowered their hands. It was over. "Sold!" the auctioneer boomed, his gavel hovering in the air. "To Vale Development." That was my cue. "Wait," I called out, my voice ringing out in the silent room. Every head turned. The auctioneer frowned. Vale's head slowly swiveled, his eyes locking on me. His face was a mask of cold annoyance. I walked forward, pushing the table ahead of me. The wheels squeaked on the polished floor. "Before you finalize that sale," I said, addressing the auctioneer but looking directly at Vale, "the community has a right to know what is being sold, and what isn't." I turned to my small audience. "Kids, parents," I said, my voice now warm and professorial, "welcome to our science project. Today's lesson? How to find treasure. You see, sometimes the most valuable things are hidden right under our feet." I could see the confusion on the faces of the developers and the flicker of interest from the parents. Vale watched me, his expression unreadable, but I saw his thumb begin to rhythmically tap the face of his pocket watch. Click, click, click. He was nervous. "This land," I said, gesturing to the map of the parcel on the easel, "is geologically unremarkable. I took one of the soil samples I'd collected from the auction lot the night before. I ran it through a quick pH test and a simple reagent analysis. As you can see, it's standard acidic clay, nothing of value here. Then, I turned to the cylinders of soil from my property. But just a few hundred feet away, in our neighborhood, the soil tells a very different story. I picked up one of the unmarked cylinders from the drill site. Mr. Vale has expressed a great deal of concern for the stability of our land, so much concern that his geotechnical teams have been performing extensive deep-level testing. Let's see what they found." I started my demonstration. It was a piece of pure theater, designed to be visually dramatic and easy to understand. I was about to prove the existence of lithium, not with a spreadsheet, but with fire. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. I took a beaker and mixed a small amount of the soil from the drill site sample with methanol from my kit. It was a classic flame test, something I'd done with my students 100 times. "Methanol burns with a nearly invisible blue flame," I explained to the kids, who were now gathered around my table, their eyes wide with fascination. "But when certain elements are introduced, they give the flame a brilliant color. It's like a chemical fingerprint." I lit the methanol. A low, pale blue flame flickered to life in the beaker. Then, slowly, I tilted it, letting the dissolved soil mixture run into the fire. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The flame erupted in a flash of brilliant, stunning crimson. A collective gasp went through the room. "That color," I said, my voice steady and clear over the hushed crowd, "is the unmistakable signature of lithium, not just traces. We're talking about deposits significant enough to be commercially mined." I straightened up and looked directly at Vale. His face, for the first time, was no longer a mask of calm superiority. It was pale. A single bead of sweat trickled down his temple. His thumb was now drumming a frantic, silent rhythm on his gold watch. "Mr. Vale knows this," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "He knows this because his company has been illegally drilling exploratory core samples under our homes for months. The sinkholes weren't accidents. They were manufactured to create a pretext, The fines, the legal threats, the fraud charge against me, it was all a smokescreen, a campaign to discredit, intimidate, and scare us into selling our land for a fraction of its true worth before anyone discovered the truth. Every eye in the room was now on Vail. The developers, the county officials, the parents. They weren't just looking at a successful businessman anymore. They were looking at a predator. "You think he was buying this worthless parcel of land for development?" I said, letting out a short, sharp laugh. "No, he was buying it for access to the real prize, which he planned to steal from right under our noses." It was then that one of the other developers, a sharp-eyed woman in the front row, spoke up. "Is this true, Vail?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence. "Have you been sitting on a mineral survey?" Vail didn't answer. He just stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He gave me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then he turned and walked out of the room, his quick, angry strides a confession in themselves. The room exploded into chaos. The auction was immediately suspended. County officials were swarming my table, peppering me with questions. The parents were looking at me with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. I had turned a boring county auction into the biggest local news story of the year. That was the end of Vail. The official investigation that followed was swift and brutal. Faced with testimony from Mike, the angry developers he'd tried to cheat, and my own irrefutable chemical analysis, his empire crumbled. The fraud charge against me was dropped so fast it left a sonic boom. The liens, the fines, the emergency bylaws, they all evaporated like mist in the morning sun. But my victory came with a choice. I was approached by a consortium of homeowners. They wanted to sue Vail for billions. They wanted me to lead the charge, to be the face of their righteous anger. It was tempting. The money would have been life-changing. But I said no. A lawsuit would have torn the community apart for years, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a scramble for cash. It would have turned our quiet neighborhood into a mining site, a pit of greed and resentment. That wasn't the justice I was looking for. Instead, I used my leverage. I met with what was left of Vail's company in the county. We brokered a deal. The mineral rights would be placed into a community trust, managed by an independent board. The projected profits would fund our schools, our parks, and our infrastructure for the next 50 years. Vail, in exchange for avoiding further criminal prosecution, would fund the creation of a new, larger park and community center, right where the old pool was. The memorial to my son wouldn't be a single line of tiles anymore. It would be a living, breathing part of the community he had sworn to protect. A few months later, I stood on the edge of that new park. The construction crews had broken ground. The air smelled of fresh-cut lumber and upturned earth. It was the smell of a new beginning. I wasn't just a teacher anymore. I had become something else, the unofficial guardian of my town's future. The burden of that old guilt over Kevin had finally started to lift, replaced by the weight of a new, heavier, but more hopeful responsibility. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old geological hammer. I looked at the worn handle, the cracked wood held together by my father's careful repair. I walked over to the foundation of the new community center and found a spot in the wet concrete. I pressed the hammer in, leaving its impression forever embedded in the stone, a broken tool that had built something new. I didn't need it anymore. My work here was done.